Dear students, welcome you all to the lecture on Michel Foucault, a postmodernist thinker. Have you ever heard of someone who was the most unique philosopher of the 20th century, someone who could perceive the invisible and philosophize the marginality that transformed the intellectual conversation once and for all time? That can only be Michel Foucault, because his main theory is that human relations are defined by power conflicts. He is the one who was successful in bringing topics such as madness and sexuality into the public debate, and he is perhaps the best person who has ever theorized what it means to be powerful and how power is associated with knowledge. I invite you all to learn more about such a man of letters whose ultimate life goal is to make us all to speak the truth even at the cost of one's self. So, today's main objectives of the lecture are to study the historical underpinnings of Foucault's thought, to study Foucault's ideas on power, knowledge, madness and sexuality, to understand some of Foucault's major philosophical expeditions. Paul Michel Foucault's influence extends beyond philosophy across the humanities and social sciences. Perhaps the thing that brought him the most notoriety was the criticism he levelled at a variety of societal institutions, most notably psychology, medicine and the legal justice system. He has been one of the important scholars of the 20th century who is known not only for his philosophical contributions, but also equally known for his unusual way of life experiences to be instrumental for his intellectual salience. His lectures at Collège de France between 1970 to 84 have had international appeal and attended by scholars across the globe. His ideas on power, knowledge, madness and sexuality are a few to mention for this class, getting their relevance more than ever these days. I assure your knowledge would be inched up towards end of this lesson by learning about the aura of Foucauldian thought that has been demonstrating our contemporary domains of knowledge and systems of thought that rule basic ethos of a life. Foucault attended the French philosopher's École Normale Supérieure in 1946 at existential phenomenology's height, where Merleau-Ponty's teachings shaped him. Foucault liked Merleau-Ponty and Saussure's structuralist theory of language. Foucault's École Normale instructors Jean Hippolyte and Louis Althusser inspired Heidegger, Hegel and Marx. There are three factors that must have been a significant influence on young Foucault. He had French tradition of history and philosophy of science represented by Georges Canguilhem, provided a model for Foucault's history of human sciences. Writings of Georges Bataille and Maurice Blanquart in specific and French avant-garde literature in general, where he found the experiential phenomenological solidity. Other philosophical milieu material that helped him to come up with assumption related to subjectivity from the point of history of human and governmentality. In the realm of academia, it is interesting to note that Jean-Paul Sartre's non-university work did not cause any concern or disturbance to Michel Foucault. However, like Sartre, Foucault despises bourgeois society and favors the sick, homosexuals, and prisoners. Foucault opposed Sartre, particularly his transcendental narcissism, and focused on individuals. Foucault critiqued the position that Sartre played as universal intellectual, which involved judging society based on universal moral criteria such as the freedom of the individual. Let's examine and comprehend some of his major philosophical expeditions of Foucault, as because covering his entire intellectual landscape may not be enough within this stipulated time. Starting with madness and medicine. In his work on history of madness in the classical age, Foucault formed an incisive and extensive archival work. His sharp criticism on what he saw the moral hypocrisy of modern psychiatry. Because the 19th century medical treatment of madness had established how preceding ages treatment related to the madness was both ignorant and brutal. For instance, the understanding of madness in Europe during the 17th century was that it entailed a renunciation of reason, in contrast to the understanding of madness that prevailed during the Renaissance, which held that mad people were mysterious forces of cosmic tragedy. In Foucault's writings, people who are insane are portrayed solely as unwell, meaning mentally ill, and they are required to undergo medical therapy. His contention was that the contemporary medical treatment of insanity is nothing more than the governing mechanisms of conventional bourgeois morality. A critique of contemporary clinical medicine is presented in Foucault's second history, The Birth of the Clinic, which was published in 1963. It follows in the footsteps of Canguilhem's History of Notions and comes much closer to being a mainstream history of science. The second one, History of Historiography. Probably one of the important contributions that fetched the fame and name to Foucault to establish himself as scholar with distinction was his The Order of Things. To put it more precisely, it is an unusual interpolation into the evolution of his mind in many different ways. This book's subtitle, which reads An Archaeology of the Human Sciences, let us know that it expands upon earlier critical histories of psychiatry and clinical medicine by delving into new contemporary fields of study such as economics, biology and philology. In the writings History of Madness and The Birth of the Clinic, an underlying social critique is conspicuously absent. This is a significant missing. On the other hand, Foucault undertook an examination of the shifting meaning of knowledge in Western thinking from the time of Renaissance up until the present day in this magnum opus of his. The idea of representation and, more crucially, Foucault's treatment of representation in philosophical thought is at the center of his story's progression from beginning to end. This is the area where Foucault directly engages with traditional philosophical questions. For instance, let us make of the following example in order to get more clarity on what he meant to be classical representation. The maps that use quite often both on online and offline are useful classical representation models. Archaeology versus genealogy. The Order of Things by Foucault takes an archaeological method for analyzing the development of thought throughout history. In 1969, 3 years after he had published The Order of Things, History of Madness and the Birth of the Clinic, he created a methodological book called The Archaeology of Knowledge. This methodological book outlines his archaeological strategy for the order of things. This method is based on the idea that the boundaries of thought are determined by the rules that govern the systems of thought and knowledge. These are referred to as epistemes or discursive constructs by Foucault. Because of this, Foucault considered history of madness to be an intellectual investigation of the profoundly different discursive frameworks that dominated discourse and thought about madness, focusing on the period from the 17th to the 19th centuries. For that, following are the key features of this methodological approach. Archaeology provided support for Michel Foucault's non-subject centered approach to history. Archaeology made it possible for the historian of thought to operate on an unconscious level, displacing the subject from phenomenology and conventional forms of historical writing. Archaeology was only able to evaluate discourse constructs from various time periods. These comparisons can imply that a particular way of thinking is contingent by demonstrating that people in bygone eras had distinct ways of thinking. However, a fundamental archaeological investigation was unable to shed light on the shift in perspective. As a result, the researchers were forced to exclude the most compelling evidence for the possibility that long-standing positions are contingent. Because of this issue, his work on discipline and punishment adopted a new methodology based on genealogy research. Foucault chose the word genealogy to invoke Nietzsche's genealogy of morality because it connotes convoluted, tedious and squalid underpinnings that are unrelated to any grand purpose of historically progressive development. An examination of ancestry demonstrates that the development of a particular school of thought was not the consequence of rationally inevitable trends, but rather of historical coincidences. Knowledge or power. The book Discipline and Punish, which came out in 1975, details the gentler method of incarcerating criminals without subjecting them to torture or putting their lives in danger. Foucault is of the opinion that fully enlightened transformation can be exploited to improve people's governance. I quote, "To punish less may be, but certainly to punish better," unquote. In addition to this, he asserts that the new paradigm of punishment exercises control over society. The modern world's workplaces, hospitals and schools are all starting to look and feel like prisons. However, we shouldn't immediately infer that a controlling organization from the center gave the order for this strategy. The analysis of Foucault demonstrates how the modern system of disciplinary authority was produced through procedures, and institutions that were developed for a wide variety of reasons, many of which were not malicious. The three fundamental strategies of social control proposed by Foucault are: number 1, hierarchical watch or gaze; number 2, normalizing judgment; number 3, examination. Observing other individuals bestows power. Therefore, the closely packed rows of seats in a stadium make it straightforward for security personnel and cameras to survey the crowd from a distance. A guard would be able to observe everything flawlessly. The similarities between this and Jeremy Bentham's panopticon will become clear. A hierarchy of gaze must relay data from lower levels in order to function properly, because this isn't always possible. The non-observance and disobedience of rules are a primary focus of modern power. This worry demonstrates that the purpose of disciplinary procedures is to address inappropriate behavior. The goal is not compensation, rather it is reform, which primarily entails learning to follow the standards that society has established. The older system of judicial punishment, which simply states whether an activity is legal or illegal, but does not indicate if the person engaging in the activity is normal or abnormal, is fundamentally distinct from normalization, which establishes specific criteria in order to instruct individuals on how to conduct themselves appropriately. The pursuit of normalcy is prevalent across society. National standards can be applied to educational courses, medical practitioners, and businesses. Students and patients in hospitals and schools respectively are subjected to hierarchical monitoring and normalizing judgment, so that the examiners and doctors can maintain control. It demonstrates what Foucault refers to as power or knowledge, which he defines as, I quote, the deployment of force and the establishment of truth, unquote. People are compelled to engage in self-reflection and self-examination, as well as to study or adhere to a treatment plan. According to Foucault, power and knowledge are far more closely related than they were in Baconian engineering. According to this interpretation, the phrase, I quote, knowledge is power, unquote, implies that power makes use of knowledge. The central argument of Foucault's work is that, at least in the context of the study of people, power and knowledge are inextricably linked. When we have knowledge of something, we have the ability to exercise control over it. Conversely, when we exercise control over something, we get additional knowledge about it. People who take the test will find themselves in a field of documentation. Controlling power systems is made easier by documents that contain test outcomes. Attendance and patient charts are typically kept in hospitals and schools. These records provide managers with the ability to form groupings, averages, and norms in order to gain further knowledge. Because of the examination, the individual will now be referred to as a case in both the scientific and medical definitions. Caring means constantly letting you take the lead. The panopticon designed by Bentham is considered by Foucault to be the most significant architectural illustration of modern authority to control people. It's a prison where every inmate has their own cell and they can't see the other inmates. Every prisoner can constantly be seen by a guard stationed in the central tower. The guards have the ability to observe any prisoner at any moment. Not that they actually do this. Prisoners are required to behave as if they are being watched at all times because they simply do not know. Therefore, the possibility of being watched from the inside out is more effective than either direct supervision or physical confinement. Foucault's genealogy places an emphasis on the body at the center of history, much like Nietzsche and psychological phenomenology. Genealogies should not be thought of as histories of the mind. These are what are known as the histories of the body. They investigate the various ways that the human body has been exploited throughout history to exert influence over others. Foucault argues in Discipline and Punishment that disciplinary practices produce docile bodies because they make offenders, soldiers, employers and school children more useful and controlled. The body was transformed into a machine through a process of optimizing, measuring and improving it. Its activities, motions and skills were taken apart, assessed and then put back together in the most effective way. The genealogical method that was utilized in Discipline and Punish served as the basis for Foucault's initial explorations into the history of sexuality. Foucault thought that modern sciences of sexuality, such as psychoanalysis, should be the primary subject of genealogical research because of the close relationship to power structures. The first volume of The History of Sexuality, titled The Will to Knowledge, was published in 1976. It contained a number of studies on modern sexuality, including ones on children, women, perverts and the population. It provided an explanation of the methodology and perspective of the history project. According to Foucault, modern sexuality management, like criminality management, makes sex, like crime, an object of ostensibly scientific disciplines that give knowledge and dominance over objects. These disciplines seek to control and dominate their subjects. Nevertheless, sexuality sciences have a second power that cannot be ignored. Both the knowledge of the doctors and the self-awareness of the patients are utilized in the control process. The sexuality sciences establish guidelines that individuals internalize and then verify themselves to ensure they are following. They are controlled as objects of the disciplines as well as subjects that are responsible for self-examining and creating themselves. According to Foucault, sexuality is the determining factor in matters of morality, health, desire and identity. The sexual orientation of the subjects must also be disclosed. According to Foucault, contemporary sexuality can be identified by the secularization of religious confessional practices. Specifically, Rather than confessing one's sexual desire to a priest, one instead visits a physician, therapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist. The repressive hypothesis, which asserts that Victorian sexuality was repressed and debate on it was hushed up, is shot down in the first chapter of the book as being false. According to Foucault, new types of discourse such as the medical, the legal and the psychological began to center on sexuality, resulting in the proliferation of such discourse. These discourses have the potential to shed light on our scientific reality through sexuality. In the book, which investigates the origins of contemporary sexuality in the 19th century, Foucault criticizes contemporary conceptions and practices. In the 1960s and 1970s, the predominant sexuality ideas asserted that all humans possessed a natural and healthy sexuality that was repressed by cultural standards such as bourgeois morality and the socio-economic structures of capitalist societies. This perspective was prevalent during this time period. Sexuality that was both active and unconstrained protected against many forms of neurosis. Therefore, prevalent sexual discourse vehemently urged sexual emancipation, arguing that we needed to free our authentic sexuality from the constraints of power. Foucault demonstrated that cultural norms and power structures are invariably the primary influences on sexuality. The idea that we should free our suppressed sexuality was flawed due to the absence of any natural sexuality that might be freed. When we broke one set of rules, it meant we had to accept another set of standards that may be just as controlling and normalizing. He made fun of our preoccupation with sexuality because we believed that it was connected to liberation. In order to examine the link between sexuality and oppressive authority, Foucault needs to rethink power. Power is not a constraining factor, but rather a creative one. It does not in any way inhibit natural sexuality. Instead, our sexuality is shaped by cultural norms and scientific research. Power dynamics are what is called, I quote, the internal conditions, unquote, of the sexual identities. The 3-page power theory that Foucault included in his book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, would go on to become one of the most significant theories in existence today. Throughout his life, he contributed to several articles, talks and interviews where he expanded and improved upon this power stance. Nonetheless, the core idea was already present. Instead, we ought to work on developing a microphysics of power that zeroes in on the numerous power centers that can be found in a society, such as households, places of employment, routine activities and ancillary organizations. Starting from the bottom up is the best approach to understand power dynamics, as well as the myriad of ways subjects can be generated within these overlapping networks. Foucault's brief but influential treatment of biopower is included in the first volume of The History of Sexuality. Foucault links it to sovereign authority, which has historically been founded on violence, specifically the right to kill. It was generally exercised by deduction, which is a right to take a piece of a nation's wealth by taxing products, goods and services, or by taking a portion of the subject's time, strength and finally life. This power was mostly exercised through taxation. The most obvious manifestations of such power were the obligation to fight in battles for the king and the imposition of the death penalty for violating orders. Foucault asserts that a shift in power dynamics has taken place in the West from the 17th century. Biopower, which I quote, strives to administer, optimize and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations, unquote, has progressively overtaken logical and violent forms of sovereign power. This era of biopower has seen a proliferation of population control measures, some of which include integrating medical treatment, normalizing conduct, rationalizing insurance and rethinking urban planning. The objective is to control one's life and body using scientific principles. Mechanisms based on power and information are increasingly used to optimize, manage and alter life. Having power over living things brings them more life, not more death. When compared to sovereign power, biopower has distinct objectives and operational procedures. Its rise has resulted in norms taking precedence over the legal system. In a society in which scientific knowledge is used to regulate and correct behavior, biopower as conceived of by Foucault is the most fundamental type of power. Biopower is controlled by specialists and bureaucrats. The History of Sexuality Volume 1 makes use of genealogy in order to historicize the body. Yet, Foucault's purpose is to present naturalist concepts regarding sex and sexuality. In the penultimate chapter of the book, Foucault discusses the scientific truth of sex. His genealogical research on sexuality challenges the concept that sex is a natural basis or an unobserved reason that underlies the observable consequences of gender and sexuality. This assumption has been challenged by his research on sexuality. He investigates the background of natural sex as defined by scientific research. He does not contend that sexuality in either its male or female forms was ever invented. Instead, he investigates how these categories came to be and how they were justified within discourses that claimed scientific reality. He also investigates how this pure explanation genuinely constructed these categories to make them seem natural. This concept has exerted a significant amount of influence on feminist and queer schools of thought. Judith Butler uses this concept to argue in her book Gender Trouble that scientific concepts of sex as a natural and necessary substrate for sexual and gendered identities serve a normative function. They determine what constitutes normal men and women and their natural sexual attraction for each other. Dear students, to conclude this lecture, we can say that Foucault's theories and observations will continue to have a significant amount of force and effect for as long as there is a social hierarchy and as long as marginalization is used as a tool solely with the intention of subjugating particular groups within society. His thoughts and ideas have garnered a lot of praise and admiration, but they have also gotten a lot of criticism. He too had been misquoted and misunderstood, much like a great number of other theorists who did not speak English. Despite of all the criticism, Foucault is known as a highly cited philosopher in the 20th century. His contribution to the intellectual arena is believed to be as potent and profound as it was when it was first made. He demonstrated how one should resist being governed and how one should resist being subjected. However, due to the fact that he was a member of a sexual minority, he led a risky life. He defied all of the standards that were established by the society and instead established his own kind of norm and standard for the intellectual world to follow in order to comprehend him. What he remarked during one of his class discussions is forever correct, and that is that, and I quote, "Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, but to refuse what we are," unquote. So, dear students, I hope you gained some knowledge through this lecture on Michel Foucault. Thank you.